Hi friends, welcome back. This video is going to show you everything you need to know about feeding your dairy cattle without the feed store. Just a friendly reminder that I wrote an article to go along with this, so if I talk too fast or too slow or you just don't like my voice, you can head over there. That'll probably be a lot easier for some of you, and I hope that helps you out. In this video, I'm going to talk about how much feed your cattle need, how much that feed costs, how much milk you can expect to get per cow, some very simple cattle nutrition, how much space it's going to take you to grow all of that feed on your own land, and then at the end I'm going to show you a way to cut 40% of your costs and land needs. And you might be wondering, yes, this is the fourth video in my How to Feed Your Animals Without the Feed Store series. We have already covered chickens, rabbits, goats, and beef. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of the dairy cattle. With dairy cows, you have the option of feeding forage only or feeding forage plus concentrated feed. All cattle need forage no matter what, and generally speaking, it is advised to give some amount of concentrated feed, like grains, to your dairy cattle. There are operations out there who are successfully only feeding forage, but usually it is best to feed forage plus a concentrated feed. Regardless, I will show you your options for feeding forage only or forage plus grains. If you want to feed grains, that is advised to be up to 1.5% of their body weight per day. That means that a 1,000-pound cow can get up to 15 pounds of grain per day. Some operations do give their dairy cattle up to 2% of their body weight in forage per day. I don't disagree with that at all, but just for this example, I am talking about 1.5%. Cows who are actively producing milk, whether for you or for their calf, will need about 4% of their body weight in forage fed every single day. If they are not lactating, that is probably closer to 2% of their body weight per day. I set this chart in front of you as 4% straight across the board just to keep it simple, but they need 4% dry forage if in milk and 2% dry forage if they are dry. I will get into the nuances of dry forage later on. Many dairy cow breeds are around 1,000 pounds at full maturity, so for a lot of these examples, you're going to see me using a 1,000-pound milk cow as the main example. This means that a non-lactating cow will need about 4.5 tons of hay per year, and a lactating cow will need about 8.5 tons of hay per year, and that is assuming that she is in milk for the whole year. Now, you are probably not going to have a cow who produces milk 365 days a year, but I am just setting it for the full year to make this math as simple as possible because it's only going to get a little more complicated from here. So because of that, this is your last reminder that everything I'm saying here I've already written down in a super handy, easy to reference article which you can find over at thehomesteaderschronicle.com. This website is a resource that my friend Kayla and I put together for other homesteaders. We are so sick of the extra fluff and especially the AI generated stuff. So this is our attempt to get rid of that and have something that is genuinely helpful. It's pretty basic, but I think it's got some good gems in there. Alright, so how much does it cost to feed your milk cow with the feed store? Each dairy cow is going to need between 4.5 and 8.5 tons of hay per year. If a round bale weighs between 700 and 1,000 pounds each, then you are going to need between 9 to 18 bales per dairy cow per year. At $60 a round bale, that is between $540 and $1,080 per cow per year. At $100 per round bale, that is between $900 and $1,800 per year. At $200 a round bale, that is between $1,800 and $3,600 per year. And finally, at $300 per round bale, you can expect to pay between $2,700 and $5,400 per year per cow. Now, I'm not going to harp on you about this throughout the whole video, but keep in the back of your mind that cows are herd animals and they will not do okay by themselves. You should always have at least 2 cows, even if it's just a mama cow and her calf. So to be completely realistic, you should probably double these numbers in your head as we go along. Anyway, that's just a side note. Sorry to rain on your parade if you were just hoping to get 1 cow. Now, when it comes to your grain cost, you've got 2, really 3 options here. Option 1 is very convenient but expensive, and that is buy by the bag. Bags are generally 40 to 50 pounds each. And the good news is you can go to the store whenever you like and pick it up and bring it home. You don't have to worry about storage and you don't have to fret about pests getting into it. but it is by far the most expensive option. Option number 2 is to buy in bulk. This allows you to buy directly from the farmer. This means that you are responsible for the long-term storage of your grain. So if it gets wet or you get a lot of pests in there or something terrible happens, like your silo just blows over, that is on you. So there is a little bit of a risk there. And of course, a silo is expensive. I cannot just breeze over that like that's some small investment. It's not. I know silos are expensive. Option 2B to that, I guess you would call it, the second option to the second option, is to buy your bulk grain in totes. A tote is quite literally just a gigantic tote. It holds about a ton each. You can buy like half totes or even quarter totes, which is 500 or 1,000 pounds at a time instead of 2,000 pounds. These do need to be kept indoors inside your barn. They are not quite as secure as a silo, but it is a storage solution if you would like to go that route. Now, these grain prices I'm about to show you are for my area. It might be a lot more expensive where you're at. It might be a lot cheaper where you're at. I hope it's a lot cheaper where you're at. Anyhow, the cheapest I can find for my area, even shipped in, is about $27 a bag. To get about 3.5 tons of feed, that's going to cost right at $3,699 a year. That is per cow per year. If I were to buy in bulk by the tote, I'm looking at more like $380 a ton, which is closer to $1,040 per year per cow. As you can tell, there is a pretty good price jump between bags and bulk. Where I'm at, it's about $5,000 more to buy by the bag rather than in bulk for 2 cows for the year. So that's definitely something to think about as you gear up to get cattle of your own. Alright, now that I just talked about the thousands of dollars that it costs to feed your dairy cow from the feed store, let's turn around and talk about the benefits of this cow. For starters, one of the byproducts of having a dairy cow is that you are going to have a new calf basically every year. And each of these calves will turn around and become sexually mature at 1 to 1.5 years old. If you're still trying to talk your significant other into getting into cattle or any other livestock for that matter, here is my very best argument for getting them. Pick their favorite inanimate object and use that against them. For example, would you buy this dirt bike if every year that dirt bike made you another dirt bike? Pretty hard to argue with that logic. Getting a brand new calf every year is definitely a perk, and that's before we even get into all of the milk and then all of those milk byproducts that you can get from your cow. Most dairy cattle breeds will produce between 3 and 9 gallons of milk per day. This equals around 53 pounds of milk per day. How much milk you can expect to get per day depends on breeds and also genetics. Generally speaking, the heavier breeds are going to need more feed, while the lighter breeds, like a Jersey, are going to need quite a bit less food. I feel like this is also a pretty decent place to tell you that you can absolutely breed your dairy cattle with beef cattle. Since modern dairy cattle produce so much milk, the little beef calves are going to grow exceptionally fast and they're going to be ready for market weight very quickly. And these little half milk, half beef calves are excellent for the dinner table, being both good growers and having a lot of good flavor. So if you are a really small homesteader and space is important to you and you would like to have the best of both worlds, that might be a good option for you. When you're choosing your first dairy cow, it's so important to talk to your potential cattle breeders and see what their intentions are, how they run their farms, and see if their values align with yours. You should really do as much research on the individual breeder as you do as the breed overall. No matter which breed you choose, your cow is probably going to give you more pounds of milk per year than feed you give them. The average 1,000 pound cow is going to eat almost 15,000 pounds of dry matter per year, and in exchange, she is going to give you about 17,000 pounds of milk back. If you're wondering how that's possible, remember that milk is 90% water, and your cow is going to drink about a bathtub's full every single day. Oh, and if you decide to keep your calves, then you're going to feed them around 2.5 tons of forage between 0 and 12 months old. Cattle are generally not as wasteful with their food as goats are, but they still have quite a bit of waste. Whether they are in the pasture or in a barn with hay in front of them, they are going to waste between 6 to 20% of their feed every single day. There are a few methods for you to use to mitigate this. I'm going to talk about that next. If given a round bale in a field, cattle will pull out a mouthful of hay, chew on it, drop a lot of it to the ground, pick out whatever they want, and then go back in for another mouthful. They're not going to be worried about cleaning up what's on the ground because they see a never-ending buffet in front of them. You do have the option of using a pitchfork to peel off a layer or two of your round bale every day and feeding that to your cattle. But there are two issues with this that most people find. Number one is that your cattle need to have access to forage 24/7. So if they don't already have grass that they can go to, then you're going to need to be forking this off several times a day to keep that forage and that rumen going and staying strong and healthy. A lot of Western operations with larger herds roll out entire round bales twice a day, and this makes the cattle mob graze, therefore competing for it, so that way they're eating as fast as they can and not wasting much. This is not as common with the dairy farms, but it's worth mentioning. I mentioned dry matter before, and I said I was going to get back to it, and now it's time to talk about that. Most grass hay is 8% moisture, which means it's 92% dry matter, while grasses still standing in the pasture are 75 to 80% moisture, meaning that they are 15 to 20% dry matter. As you probably already figured out, cattle are going to eat quite a bit more off of fresh pasture compared to dry hay or alfalfa. So if a 1,000-pound cow needs 2% dry matter and hay is 92% dry matter, and she is wasting 15% of it, then she actually needs 23.53 pounds of hay, not 20 pounds. If you've got a cow in milk, she's actually going to need 4% dry matter. So again, if hay is 92% dry matter and she's wasting 15% of it, then she actually needs 47.06 pounds of hay and not 40 pounds. So when you see online resources telling you that your cow needs a certain amount of dry matter, make sure that you are actually paying attention to what the water content is in what you're feeding, and you're paying attention to animal waste. It's always best to leave a little bit of a buffer if you can. If you'd like to feed silage or haylage, remember that 3 pounds of silage equals 1 pound of dry matter, and 2 to 2.5 pounds of haylage equals 1 pound of dry matter. I'm not going to go into any more detail on silage or haylage in this video for cows. So right now I'm going to tell you that the average is 24 tons of silage per acre. You can use that to calculate your needs for your cattle on your place if you're interested in that. Basically, for every 7 to 8 bushels of grain that you're getting per acre, you can expect to get around 1 ton of silage. Dairy cattle really are great at taking care of those extra byproducts from the farm. Now let's talk about how much forage you're going to get per acre in your area, so that way we can figure out how much space you need to pasture raise your cattle. Most people raise their cattle on pasture for a majority of the year and then feed hay during the winter months. Several of these producers know that they give their cattle between 1 to 10 acres of space each during the summer and then feed X amount of hay bales over the winter. Many don't know how much space it takes to grow the hay, they just know how much the hay costs per bale and how many bales they need to survive the winter. But for this figure, we're going to get deeper into it. To grow all of your own pasture and all of your own hay, you have to rotationally graze your cattle and/or have dedicated pasture space with dedicated hay fields. Here in Montana, you can put one animal unit, also called a cow and calf pair, equal to a 1,000-pound mama and a 6-month-old calf on 10 acres. So if you wanted to have 3 mama cows with their 3 babies, you would need about 30 acres. In the Midwest, it's closer to 1 to 2 acres per animal unit. There, it will take 3 to 6 acres to feed 3 mamas and their 3 babies. Basically, you need to figure out how productive the land is in your area, either your land specifically or a general number from your local region. I have put just a few of the state averages up on the screen for you. Please note that these numbers are state averages. They do not tell you whether irrigation is used or not. Many farms in Florida are not irrigating, while nearly all of Arizona does. Context is so important here, so make sure that you're following average practices in your area if you want to hit average yields. Also, these numbers do not tell you how many cuttings you should make per year. They are only telling you the total amount for the year, so you'll have to cut according to your area's growth rate. Some places you might get 1 cutting, and in other places you might get as many as 6 per year. You can make your land a lot more productive through intensive rotational grazing, better land management, fertilization, and irrigation or drainage if needed. The perk of being a small homesteader or a small farmsteader is that it is much easier to upkeep your land because it's a more manageable size. Okay, you might have caught that I said that my area needs 10 acres per animal, while Montana as a whole needs 75 acres per animal to be self-sustaining. Yet in those previous numbers, I just said that 1 acre equals 1.6 tons of hay. What the heck is that about? The reason for this is that most Montana hayfields are either near a river or irrigated with pipes, while most Montana ranchers don't run their cattle near the waterways and they usually don't irrigate the pastures. Now that you have a decent idea of how much hay you can get per acre, you can figure out how much land you need to grow enough hay per cow. In the Midwest and South, you're looking at 2 to 3 acres per cow. In the Northeast, you're looking at about 4 acres per cow. And out west, it's around 5 acres per cow. Arizona is the weird little outlier who is exceptional at irrigating fields. So their hay averages are very, very high per acre, meaning you only need about 1 acre per cow. Now we'll talk about very basic dairy cow nutrition. I'm not going to get into the details of how their digestive system works. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about that, make sure you go over to the How to Feed Your Goat Without the Feedstore video. I have timestamps throughout the whole video so you can just jump straight to it. I did not want to repeat that for the 4th or 5th time for you guys who are repeat watchers. The largest component of your dairy cow's diet is going to be carbs and crude fiber. Digestible carbs are carbs, indigestible carbs are fibers. Just about every single type of ingredient that goes into cattle feed is going to have a good portion of it being carbs and crude fiber. Your cows will need about 12% fiber and 49-50% carbs. But don't worry, you usually don't need to track this. It is naturally in their diets and there is an abundance of it. Digestible fibers give them energy and calories, while indigestible fibers take really good care of the rumen and make sure that your animal doesn't either bloat or have some painful, sometimes deadly blockages. Milk cows generally need more fatty acids than beef cows because they are putting out a lot of fat in their milk every day. They need these fatty acids not only to go into the milk, but also to absorb the nutrients and vitamins that they're getting through their food. Keep the fatty acids under 7% of the diet, and no more than 2% of each of these added fats should come from animal, vegetable, or rumen inert fats. Basically, they need a diversity of fatty acids, not just fat coming from one single source. Hay, corn, oats, sunflower seeds, sorghum, rye, and a lot of types of seeds and nuts are great sources of this. Soybeans and soybean byproducts are a very popular source of cattle feed, especially in the Midwest and the South, which is why I feel the need to give you this disclaimer that you should not feed soybeans to your cows until they're at least 300 pounds. Your cow needs a mature digestive system before they're able to appropriately take on soybeans. If you do decide to start feeding soybeans, feed them in a small quantity, about 1/4 pound per animal per day to get the fat content up and cycling faster. Only feed soybean meal, not crushed or whole soybeans. Crushed and whole soybeans contain a lot of oil, which is what goes into our vegetable oil. And as you can imagine, that oil is very high in fat, and that high fat will ruin their rumen. That's like diarrhea on steroids. You don't want to go down that road. Soybeans will go bad within about 3 weeks of being ground, so store them whole and grind them as you need them. But ideally, you're going to use soybean meal, which has already had all of the oil pressed out of it and makes it a byproduct. We will talk about byproducts later, but I've got the soybean disclaimer out of the way. I feel a lot better, and I hope I can keep you and your cattle safe this way. When your cows first start producing milk, they're going to need 17 to 18% protein, and as they finish up the season, they're going to drop down to 13 to 15% protein. Alfalfa ranges between 12 and 28% protein naturally, while grass hay is around 10% protein, and that is why most dairy producers tend to use alfalfa over grass hay. Wheat, soybean meal, canola meal, cornmeal, seeds, sprouts, parsley, and peas are also good sources of protein. Your dairy cow will need at least 17 minerals in her diet, including magnesium, potassium, sodium, sulfur, cobalt, copper, iodine, iron, manganese, selenium, and zinc. These are usually abundant in wild forages, especially in younger plants like young alfalfa, young leafy greens, young hay, sprouts, and saplings. If you want to supply all of these minerals from your own land, you're probably going to need to do some extensive testing both in your soil and in your forages. and from there you'll need to make amendments as necessary. Of course, you can also purchase very affordable minerals from the feed store to get you started at least, but these minerals are not something you want to skimp out on. These are essential for growing bones, balancing electrolytes, and making sure that your cattle don't have any serious illnesses or deficiencies. And remember that if you and your family are drinking the milk that comes from this cow, you don't want to have any of these shortages of minerals either. I have all of their mineral needs up on the screen. If you're using your phone, feel free to take a screenshot right now. And don't forget that dairy cows need between 3 to 4 ounces of salt every single day. Your cow has to have vitamins to utilize the carbs, fats, and protein that she's getting every single day from you. Vitamins A, C, D, E, and K are the most essential. Don't worry about B. If her diet is balanced, then she can make that all on her own. Vitamins are usually found in wild forages, leafy greens, vegetables, grains, seeds, fruits, legumes, and sprouts. Now that you understand their nutrition, we can try and visualize about how much hay your cow is going to need. From 0 to 12 months old, they're going to need about 5 round bales. And then every year that she is an adult and producing milk, she's going to need around 20 round bales per year. This assumes that she is eating 4% of her body weight in dry forage every day. As you can imagine, she is not going to eat quite as much hay if you are also providing grains. And for the last time, I'm going to say that I don't necessarily recommend feeding pasture or hay only for your high production dairy cattle. While there are people out there who are doing this successfully and their cows have great body conditioning, I just think that this is not something that is feasible for a lot of new farmers or new homesteaders. Just be very careful and talk to an expert before you go down this path, okay? When it comes to feeding grains to your cattle, you have quite literally endless options. I came up with a very simple example just so I could give you a very basic idea of how much space you're going to need to grow all the feed for your animal. I highly recommend you go to the Clemson EDU calculator that I'm going to have linked below in the description. It lets you input whatever feed you want and it tells you exactly the nutritional profile of that feed. It ranges from anything from hay and alfalfa and corn, the basics, to even things like donuts. So if you are wanting to feed kitchen scraps or byproducts to your cattle, you can absolutely do that, and you can do that with the security of knowing what's going into your cow and how that is affecting her. Anyway, for this example, I am setting it as 60% alfalfa, 20% corn, 10% soybean meal, and 10% oats. And of course, this is in addition to free choice forage where your cow can eat as much as she wants of grass, hay, or alfalfa on the side. Yes, I did add alfalfa into this. The reason for that is a lot of cattle producers, both dairy and beef farmers, will chop up some kind of forage to put into the grain. So you can put in a couple bales of hay and then a few buckets of corn and then a few buckets of your soybean meal and your oats and barley and whatever, and it all mixes it up into this nice powder. And then you can give that powder or pellet or whatever you may want to call it to your cattle every single day. This particular combination is going to get you 16% protein, 3.1% fat, 20% fiber, and about 60% carbohydrates. Again, I highly recommend you check out the Clemson EDU calculator. That thing is absolutely fascinating. I could spend hours on that. Corn is a very popular choice for grain concentrates because it can grow very closely together and it is quite easy to grow. If you want corn to be the only grain you're giving to your cattle, you only need about a half acre per cow per year. If you want corn to make up 20% of your concentrate, as shown in the example on the previous slide, you're going to need 0.4 of an acre of corn per cow per year. If you want to feed soybean meal as 10% of the concentrate, then you are going to need 547 pounds per cow. If you feed whole soybeans, that is 0.2 of an acre, and if you're feeding soybean meal, that is 0.4 of an acre. I do recommend soybean meal, but use what you have. All of these figures are assuming that you are getting about 3,000 pounds of soybeans per acre per year. Oats are one of the more expensive grains to put into your cattle feed, but it's excellent for milk production, so I thought it earned a spot here. As 10% of the concentrate, you are going to need 547 pounds of oats per cow per year. Assuming that you get 5,000 pounds of oats per acre, you are going to need about a tenth of an acre, which is close to 4,765 square feet of space per cow per year. Don't worry about the alfalfa that's mixed into this concentrate. That is already factored in with your forage. Okay, it's finally time to talk grand totals on space needed. If you are only feeding your cattle forage with no grain, you are going to need between 1 to 6 acres per animal per year on hay only. If you have very poor pasture or rangeland, this could be up to 75 acres, but for most of the US, this is going to be 1 to 6 acres. Okay, the grand total for feeding grains is half of an acre if you're only feeding your cow corn, or 9/10 of an acre if you are feeding 20% corn, 10% soybean meal, and 10% oats, in addition to your 60% alfalfa. When you add up the forage and grains, it is 1.5 to 6.9 acres per cow. Okay, here's the part that I promised you of how to cut 40% of your feed bill across the board, meaning you use 40% less money or 40% less effort or 40% less of your land. Right now in California, almost 40% of each dairy cow's diet is coming from byproducts. These byproducts include distillers grain, soybean meal, almond hulls, and citrus pulp. Now, I know that some people regard California as having some hippie and silly ideas that aren't going to work on the large scale, but California is the large scale for the US. California is the largest milk producer in the United States. They contribute 20% of the milk to the entirety of the United States. This is not some small scale thing. They are the leading producer of milk, which is then followed by Wisconsin, Idaho, Texas, and then New York. While some of the other states don't have as much citrus pulp or almond hulls laying around, it does have an abundance of other things, especially distillers grain and soybean meal. There is a decent byproduct solution for each part of the United States, and since byproducts are technically waste, they are cheap or even free. They do not take up any of the precious space on your farm or your homestead. If you're curious about common byproducts that you can safely feed to your dairy cows, here are some of the most popular ones for you to think about. First is soybean meal, which is leftover from making cooking oil. Beet pulp is leftover from making sugar for sugar beets. Seed hulls are another good food for cows. These are leftover from cracking nuts like peanuts, pistachios, almonds, walnuts, and more. Cotton seeds and cotton hulls are other good options. These are leftover from making cotton for our clothing. Brewer's grains are leftover from making beer from barley, wheat, and hops. Citrus pulp is leftover from making juice from oranges, lemons, and pomegranates. Corn gluten feed is what's left over from making sugar for soda from corn. Candy waste is another option, believe it or not, and it is safe for cows. This is usually leftover chocolates and gummy bears. And lastly is bakery waste, mostly stale cakes, breads, donuts, and other bakery items. If you are interested in feeding byproducts, start looking for sources now, even if you don't have cattle of your own just yet. This can slash your feed costs by, like I said, up to 40%. So it's definitely worth the time to go look into it. And even if someone doesn't have anything available right now, maybe later on a farmer will drop out of the list or whatever, and then you can take a spot and be the next in line for whatever that free byproduct is. If you need a good visualization of what 40% off looks like, that's the equivalent of having someone pay all of your feed bills from January until about the 3rd week of May. That is pretty significant. So let's incorporate that into our figures from earlier. If you're going forage only and you only want forage that is still 1 to 6 acres per cow, but if you want to do forage, grains, and byproducts, that drops your space needed from 0.9 of an acre to 4.14 acres per cow per year. Okay, that's it for this video. Don't forget I have similar videos on chickens, rabbits, goats, and beef cattle. It's currently August of 2024. If you're watching it much later than then, I will probably have more animal stuff up later. Thank you for letting me talk at you this long. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for being here.